Welcome to this deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be taking a look at some of the ideas around identity. It's that instant gratification mindset,
Yeah.
like get the reward, move on to the next thing.
Right.
But without that deeper purpose,
Right.
it's easy to lose sight of why you're even doing it.
Right.
And Peterson early links this to conscientiousness,
Okay.
one of the big 5 personality traits.
Mm-hmm.
So like highly conscientious people tend to be more goal-oriented and organized and disciplined.
Right.
They're able to delay gratification,
Yeah.
work towards those long-term goals.
It's interesting to think about that in terms of like identity, right? Because if you are somebody who's not really thinking about the long game, you're just kind of bouncing from one thing to the next.
Right. Are you really building anything substantial? Are you really developing a sense of self that's grounded in something meaningful?
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like if you're always chasing the next quick fix,
Right.
you never really develop a strong foundation.
Yeah. And so for the listener, right, think about your own life.
Okay.
Think about what motivates you.
Mm-hmm.
Are you driven by those immediate rewards, or are you playing the long game?
It's a good question to ask yourself
Yeah.
because it really ties into how we build our identity.
Mm-hmm.
And this leads perfectly into Peterson's next point about language.
Okay, yeah. He's really big on the idea that we shouldn't take language lightly,
Oh, absolutely.
right? He even says that using language trivially
Mm-hmm.
is a sign of being off the path.
Because language is more than just a tool for communication.
Okay.
It's a reflection of our values.
Yeah.
Our beliefs, our very essence.
Yeah.
Every
Yeah.
word we choose, every sentence we construct carries weight.
Right.
It reveals something about who we are.
It's like our words are a window into our soul.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Peterson gives this example of the word love.
Okay.
It's a word that we throw around all the time. We
Yeah.
do, but what does it really mean?
Right.
How does the way we use that word or fail to use it reflect our understanding of love and how we live it out in our relationships?
Right. And it's interesting, too, because he makes this connection between language and this idea of the material and the transcendent.
Yes.
And it's not immediately obvious, like, how those things connect.
Right.
But he uses this really fascinating example of writing with a pen.
Oh, yeah.
And he's like, okay, think about all the things that have to happen for you to just pick up a pen and write something.
It's mind-boggling when you really break it down.
It is.
All those complex physical and neurological processes
Yeah.
that we take for granted.
Totally. And then he's like, and behind all of that
Right.
is this vast universe of mystery
Exactly.
that we can't even fully comprehend.
That we can only partially grasp.
Right. And so it's like, even at that most basic level of physical action, we're encountering this realm of the transcendent.
Which refers to those aspects of reality that lie beyond our immediate grasp,
Right.
that point towards something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah. And as we move from that basic physical action to higher levels of thought, meaning, purpose, we encounter even greater mysteries.
It's like there's this whole universe of meaning embedded within us and around us,
Right.
waiting to be uncovered.
And our identity, our sense of self, is deeply entwined with both the material world and this realm of the transcendent.
Absolutely.
But then Peterson challenges this notion that identity is purely subjective, right?
Yes.
Like we are who we say we are, and that's it.
He argues against the idea that we can simply choose our identity based solely on our desires or whims.
Right.
He uses this analogy of a 2-year-old
Okay.
who wants everything immediately.
Right.
If we only focus on fulfilling our immediate desires, without considering the long-term consequences, we end up stunted,
Yeah.
never really maturing into our full potential.
It's like we're stuck in this perpetual state of adolescence, always chasing those instant highs, but never building anything truly meaningful.
Yeah.
And, he has that really interesting analogy about pornography and the porn fairy.
Oh, yes.
And how that highlights the election of instant gratification.
Right. You're promised this magical experience,
Right.
but it ultimately leaves you feeling empty and disconnected.
Yeah. And I think that's a really powerful image for how pursuing these fleeting pleasures can actually hinder our growth and prevent us from forming those really genuine connections.
Absolutely.
And this brings us to one of Peterson's favorite examples, the story of Peter Pan, the boy who refuses to grow up.
Classic tale.
Yeah. And he chooses this fantasy world of Neverland over the responsibilities and complexities of adulthood.
Right, because who wants to grow up?
Right. But as Peterson points out, Peter Pan's refusal to mature isn't just about him.
Yeah.
It affects everyone around him.
Right. Think about Wendy.
Right.
She's drawn to Peter's carefree spirit, but ultimately she can't have a real relationship with him
Right.
because he's stuck in this Neverland mindset.
And then there's Captain Hook,
Right.
right? The tyrannical villain who's obsessed with controlling everything and everyone.
Mm.
And Peterson argues that Hook's tyranny stems from this deep fear of time and death,
Right.
symbolized by that ticking clock in the crocodile's belly.
It's like he's trying to escape the inevitability of aging
Right.
and the responsibilities that come with it.
Yeah, but in doing so, he becomes a prisoner of his own fear.
Exactly.
And that makes you wonder, are there aspects of Neverland that we might be clinging to in our own lives?
Mm-hmm.
What fears might be holding us back from embracing responsibility
That's a great question.
and stepping into our full potential?
Yeah.
And I think that to answer that question, we need to move beyond the idea of responsibility as simply a duty
Okay.
and see it as a stepping stone to something even greater, the call to adventure.
The call to adventure.
Yeah.
I like that. It's kind of like we can get stuck in that Neverland mentality.
Right.
And that can actually prevent us from answering that call to adventure that you were just talking about.
Okay, so what does it even mean to answer that call?
Well, I think Peterson uses a really good example from The Hobbit,
Okay.
Bilbo Baggins.
Right.
You know, he's perfectly content in his cozy little hobbit hole.
Yeah, loves his routine.
Exactly. And then Gandalf shows up and whisks him away on this grand adventure.
Right, completely disrupts his life.
Yeah, and it's a classic example of stepping outside your comfort zone, you know,
Right.
facing the unknown and discovering strengths that you never knew you had.
And it's not always easy, right?
No, it's not supposed to be easy.
Like, it can be really uncomfortable and even painful at times.
Exactly. In fact, Peterson actually emphasizes that true growth often involves confronting suffering and hardship.
Okay, that seems kind of counterintuitive though, right?
It does.
Like, we naturally want to avoid pain,
Of course.
but he's saying that we should actually seek it out.
Well, not necessarily seek it out, but be willing to face it.
Okay.
Embrace it even.
Because it's through those challenges that we develop resilience and wisdom and a deeper understanding of ourselves.
He uses the analogy of physical exercise.
Go.
Like if you never lift weights,
Right.
your muscles will atrophy. But if you consistently challenge yourself, you grow stronger.
Right.
It's the same with our character, our spirit.
So it's like we need to be willing to step into the arena, so to speak.
Exactly.
Get a little bruised and battered in order to become the best versions of ourselves.
Yeah, you gotta be willing to get your hands dirty.
And this is where he connects it to the hero's journey, right?
Yes, the hero.
Narrative archetype that we see in myths and stories across cultures.
Right. The hero doesn't just magically become strong and courageous.
Right.
They have to earn it.
They have to go through those trials and tribulations and face their fears.
Think about Bilbo again. He was terrified to leave the Shire.
Yeah, he did not want to go on that adventure.
But he faced giant spiders, goblins, a dragon.
Right. He went through some serious stuff.
Yeah. And with each challenge, he overcame.
Yeah.
He grew a little braver, a little wiser, a little more heroic.
And through those struggles, he discovered all these hidden depths within himself.
Right, like when he finds the One Ring.
Oh, yeah.
And has to confront Gollum.
Right. Huge moment.
He's tempted to use the ring's power for selfish gain.
Yeah.
But ultimately, he chooses compassion and mercy.
And I think that's such a great example of how confronting these challenges forces us to make these difficult choices and reveals our true character.
Yeah, it's not about being perfect or never making mistakes.
It's about learning from those mistakes and continuing to strive towards something greater.
Exactly.
So this brings us to, I think, the next stage of the hero's journey.
Okay.
Confronting the dragon.
The dragon.
Yeah. So what is the dragon in this context?
Well, the dragon represents those primal fears and forces of destruction that we all have to face at some point in our lives.
So it could be anything like addiction, trauma, loss, failure.
Yeah, all those things that threaten to consume us.
Right, to hold us back from living a meaningful life.
Exactly.
And Peterson's saying that confronting those dragons is essential for true growth and transformation.
He says it's not about conquering them in some kind of epic battle,
Okay.
but about integrating them, understanding them.
So more about facing our demons than slaying them.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is where he brings in the Christian passion story.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, how so?
Well, he sees the crucifixion as an archetype of voluntarily accepting suffering for a greater purpose.
Okay.
Christ's descent into hell symbolizes confronting the ultimate depths of malevolence and despair.
Wow, that's pretty intense.
It is.
So are you saying we're all supposed to be like Jesus, sacrificing ourselves on the cross?
Not literally, of course.
Okay, good.
But metaphorically, yes.
Okay.
We are all called to confront the dragons in our own lives,
Right.
to face our fears, to make sacrifices for something greater than ourselves.
So it's about choosing love and compassion over hatred and fear. Okay,
Exactly.
I can see where you're going with this, but those are some pretty big shoes to fill.
I know.
How are we supposed to live up to that ideal in our everyday lives?
Well, it starts with small choices,
Okay,
everyday acts of courage and kindness.
like what?
Choosing to speak up against injustice, even when it's uncomfortable.
Right.
Choosing to forgive someone who's wronged you, even when it hurts.
Okay.
Choosing to help someone in need, even when it's inconvenient.
Those are all really powerful examples.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying that heroism isn't just about slaying literal dragons.
Right.
It's about those everyday acts of moral courage, those small choices that make a big difference.
And that's what building a strong and meaningful identity is all about.
Okay.
It's about aligning ourselves with something bigger than ourselves,
Right.
something that gives our lives purpose and direction.
But how do we even begin to articulate that something bigger?
That's a good question.
How do we communicate those values and ideals that shape who we are?
Well, that brings us back to the power of language.
Right, full circle.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about facing our dragons and this call to adventure and striving for something bigger than ourselves. But I want to circle back to this idea of language.
Yes, language.
Because Peterson's really big on this idea that we shouldn't be careless with our words.
Absolutely. He argues that language isn't just about conveying information, it's about creating meaning. It's about shaping reality.
Right, and it's about revealing who we are at our core.
Exactly. It's like every word we speak is a building block of our identity.
Right.
It's a reflection of our values and our place in the world.
And he makes this fascinating connection to the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Yeah.
Like this idea that God spoke the world into being.
Right. And God said, let there be light, and there was light.
Okay, that's pretty mind-blowing. So
Right.
are you saying that our words actually have the power to create?
In a sense, yes. Think about the impact our words have on others.
Okay.
Words of encouragement can inspire and uplift. Words of criticism can wound and discourage. The language we use shapes our thoughts, our beliefs, and ultimately our actions.
It's like we're constantly weaving a tapestry with our words,
Mm.
creating the world around us thread by thread.
And Peterson takes it a step further.
Okay.
He argues that every word we speak is either a manifestation of the fact that we're made in the image of God or a rebellion against that.
Whoa, hold on. That's a pretty weighty statement.
Mm.
What does he mean by that?
Well, if we believe that we're created in the image of God,
Right.
that implies a certain level of responsibility.
Okay.
Our words should reflect that divine spark within us.
So they should be truthful, kind, compassionate, uplifting.
Exactly. It's not just about avoiding negative language. It's about actively using language to create good in the world.
So it's like we're all these little creators
Mhm.
wielding this powerful tool of language to shape reality.
And that brings us back to the question of how we find meaning and purpose in the face of all these challenges.
Right, like we were talking about earlier.
The answer, in part, lies in how we use language.
So if we focus on using language to create good, to inspire, to uplift, to heal,
Yeah.
we're actually embodying that heroic spirit that Peterson talks about.
Precisely. It's about using our words to confront those dragons of negativity, cynicism, despair,
Right.
and to speak a more hopeful and beautiful reality into existence.
It's really fascinating how Peterson immediately challenges how we see the world. He says we don't actually experience it through just facts.
Right.
There are just way too many, right? So instead we rely on stories. There are these frameworks of meaning and value to make sense of it all.
It's true. Imagine trying to process everything at once. That's impossible. So it's like when you're on a date in a noisy restaurant, right?
Yeah.
You focus on your date's conversation, kind of tune everything else out.
Exactly.
That's your story, your goal in that moment, shaping what you pay attention to.
Yeah, and Peterson, he doesn't stop there. He argues that stories are also how we learn, how we connect with each other, and even how we practice for those tough challenges we face in real life.
Oh, totally.
Think about it, why are we drawn to certain stories?
Yeah.
Like horror movies, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's because they give us a safe space to sort of explore those anxieties that we, might be facing in real life.
Yeah, it makes sense. We get to confront our fears,
Mhm.
but in this controlled environment. And the story of Adam and Eve. How does Peterson approach that?
He sees the Adam and Eve story as this exploration of human limitations and the consequences of, maybe overreaching. He analyzes the symbolism within the story, like the Garden of Eden, the forbidden fruit, and the serpent.
Okay.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, with each layer revealing like a deeper meaning.
Okay, so let's unpack some of those layers. What does he say about the Garden of Eden?
He describes it as this walled garden, right, representing the balance of nature, which is the garden itself, and culture, represented by the walls. It's a space of safety and abundance, but it also has these boundaries.
Hmm.
This symbolizes kind of like this ideal state of existence.
And the forbidden fruit, that's knowledge of good and evil, right? What's
Well,
Peterson's take on that?
he connects this to Nietzsche's idea that, God is dead, meaning that in a secular world, we have to figure out our own values, right?
Yeah.
But Peterson argues that, you know what, we humans, we're terrible at this.
That's slightly.
He uses the example of failed New Year's resolutions
Oh, yeah.
to show just how easily we falter.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, we can't even stick to a diet, let alone create this like whole moral system for ourselves.
It's true. We are often our own worst enemies in that sense. So how does the serpent fit into all of this?
Peterson portrays the serpent as the voice of pride and temptation. It's that little voice inside all of us, right?
Yeah.
That whispers, you know better than the established order, tempting us to believe that we can like just define good and evil for ourselves.
So Adam and Eve give in to temptation and eat the fruit. What does Peterson actually define as their real sin?
He argues that it wasn't simply just disobeying God, but the pride that led them to believe they could, set their own rules. And this pride, he says, leads to shame, this self-consciousness, and ultimately suffering. It's like, that classic fall from grace narrative, but Peterson connects it to our, like, everyday experiences.
It's about the choices we make, the stories we tell ourselves, and then the consequences we end up facing. It's not just an ancient myth, it's a reflection of like the human condition. But there's more to unpack here, right?
Yeah.
What about the specific sins of Adam and Eve? What stood out to you about that part of the lecture?
Well, it's interesting. Peterson connects their sins to, like, these classic gender stereotypes, but with this deeper psychological twist. He says Eve's sin is, like this overreaching maternal compassion.
Mm-hmm.
She's tempted by the serpent, this marginalized figure. And in her pride, she embraces it, even though there's this, like, divine warning.
But isn't compassion supposed to be like a good thing? How does Peterson square that with, his interpretation of Eve's actions as a transgression?
Yeah, that's a great question. He suggests that Eve's compassion, while, well-intentioned, becomes problematic because it's driven by pride.
Mm-hmm.
She believes she knows better than, God, that she can nurture even the dangerous and deceptive.
Right.
It's like a cautionary tale, he sees it, against naive compassion.
So it's not about like condemning compassion itself. It's more about recognizing that there can be pitfalls when it's not, balanced with wisdom and discernment.
Exactly.
It's like she's trying to, mother the whole world, even the dangerous parts, without really considering the potential consequences.
Precisely. Yeah. And Peterson suggests that, maybe we can see this playing out in society today, this tendency to, like, infantilize and coddle, even when it might be harmful in the long run.
So while Eve's transgression is rooted in this like excessive compassion, Peterson says Adam's fall comes from like a different kind of temptation, right?
Right.
What's his take on Adam's sin?
He frames it as this ambition to impress women,
Okay.
to provide, like, everything they desire, even if it means, compromising his integrity. He gives into Eve's demands, even though he knows it's wrong.
Isn't this, kind of relying on those traditional gender roles a little bit? Like, could Peterson's analysis be, I don't know, updated to reflect a more nuanced understanding of, like, gender dynamics?
Yeah, I mean, that's a valid point. His analysis does tend to, like, lean on these traditional archetypes.
Right.
But if we look beyond just the gender specifics, there's a broader point about the dangers of ambition and validation seeking. Like, Adam's desire to please Eve, even to the cost of, his own moral compass, speaks to a universal human tendency. We compromise our values for approval or for status.
So he's driven by this need for validation, and it ultimately, leads him astray.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, comes the fallout, the shame, the hiding, the blame game. Peterson really paints this, like, vivid picture of their descent into, like, self-consciousness and misery.
Yeah, he highlights how this self-consciousness, this, like, hyper-awareness of their own, inadequacies, is a direct result of their pride and disobedience. They've fallen from this state of, like, innocent bliss into a world of self-doubt and suffering.
And then there's that moment when God calls out to Adam asking, "Where are you?" And Adam, he's hiding in the bushes and he tries to shift the blame, first to Eve and then to God himself.
It's classic, right? Peterson points out how this inability to own up to their mistakes is such a, like, classic human
Oh,
response.
yeah.
It's easier to blame others, to play the victim than to face the consequences of our actions.
So in Peterson's view, both Adam and Eve are kind of like condemned to suffer in their work as a consequence of their pride.
Hmm.
And that's how he sees like the very beginning of human history, this cycle of ambition, pride, transgression, and ultimately suffering.
But what's really striking is that Peterson doesn't present this as, purely a religious message.
Right.
He connects it to our everyday experiences, the way we make choices, the stories we tell ourselves, the consequences we face.
Right, exactly. He's saying this isn't just some ancient myth, it's like a reflection of the human condition itself. It's the struggle we all face as we try to navigate this world that's full of temptation, ambition, and, this constant potential for self-deception. But he doesn't really tell us, like, how we're supposed to choose which stories to believe in, does he? I mean, if stories are how we see the world, how do we know which ones are leading us toward truth and which ones are, leading us astray?
Yeah, that's the real question, isn't it? Like, how do we
Mm.
choose the right stories?
Yeah.
And it feels like Peterson just kind of leaves that for us to figure out. He gives
Yeah.
us this whole analysis of Genesis, but doesn't really like give us an answer for how to navigate all these different narratives out in the world.
I mean, he doesn't give us like a step-by-step guide, but I think he gives us the tools we need to be more like, critical about the stories that we come across.
He encourages us to question our assumptions, really examine the stories that shape our lives, and then I guess ultimately choose the ones that resonate with us the most and, lead us toward a sense of meaning and purpose.
So it's more about like not just passively accepting the stories we're told, but actively questioning them, thinking about what they're really saying.
Exactly. And it's not just, these big narratives like the, Freudian Marxist or the biblical stories.
Hmm.
It's also about those smaller stories, right? The ones that we tell ourselves and each other every single day.
Yeah.
Think about the stories that you tell yourself about your successes, your failures, your relationships, your hopes, your fears. All of those stories, they shape your reality just as much as those bigger cultural
It's
narratives.
like those stories can almost become like self-fulfilling prophecies, right?
Yeah.
If you keep telling yourself that you're not good enough, well, you're probably going to act in ways that confirm that belief. But, if you choose to focus on stories of resilience and growth, well, you're more likely to actually overcome those challenges and achieve the things you set out to do.
Exactly. It's a powerful reminder that we're not like powerless in this. We actually have some say in shaping our own narratives. We're not just, passively receiving stories. We're actually actively creating them.
This has been such an interesting deep dive. We went from the structure of perception to the Garden of Eden, and it all comes back to this idea that stories, they're not just entertainment. They're the fabric of our reality.
Yeah, and that understanding them, being critical of them, that's essential for just navigating all the complexities of being human.
Mm.
Peterson's lecture, it really reminds us of like the power of stories and that we all play a role in choosing those narratives that will shape, not just our own lives, but the world around us.
So as you go about your day, your week, your life, I want you to pay attention to the stories you encounter.
The ones you tell yourself, the ones you hear from others, the ones that kind of dominate our culture. And just ask yourself, what are these stories really saying? What values are they promoting? And most importantly, are these stories that I want to live by? Because
Hmm.
ultimately, the stories that we choose are the ones that end up shaping the world that we create.